there's something to life that's not comfortable. It's constantly creating, it's constantly uncertain,
Mm-hmm.
and that
Mm-hmm.
that creating tension is there. And I think poetry makes you feel that.
Of course, there's an element of laziness, and also I think a lot of fear at the introspection that inevitably comes with poetry.
I think that's why even the phrases mental health and mental illness are problematic, because our fundamental picture does not include mind.
Is there a doctor in the house? Is there a doctor in the house?
I'm a doctor.
What's up, Doc?
Hi, I'm Bianca Stone. Welcome to the Ruth Stonehouse podcast. I'm very excited to have Dr. Anoop Kumar here today talking with me. Having spent most of his life exploring the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta and its implications on the relationships among consciousness, mind, body, and society, Dr. Kumar found that our understanding of these is outdated and incomplete, to say the least. He spent the last several years speaking around the world, writing books, and encouraging audiences to rethink consciousness and unveil a more complete experience of life that also informs solutions to real-world problems. He's the author of several books, including Michelangelo's Medicine, How Redefining the Human Body Will Transform Health and Healthcare, and Is This a Dream? Reflections on the Awakening Mind. He's a practicing doctor in emergency medicine and is a mind-body strategist. Dr. Kumar, welcome.
Thank you, Bianca. I'm happy to be with you here.
Yay. So you work in, I assume, emergency medicine as an emergency room.
Yeah.
So this is a highly empirical profession. You've obviously gone through the rigors of medical school. Did you always have at the same time this interest in the mind-body dichotomy and consciousness? And you said you've been for the last several years been doing these talks, but how did you come to have this passionate public conversation?
Well, I've probably been having talks with myself for decades.
Yeah.
And at some point, they started to tickle my vocal cords and they became vocalized at some point.
Right.
But I kind of grew up in this environment where the family was immersed in Advaita, which is a philosophy of ancient India, which talks about the unity underlying diversity and the diversity overlying unity. So it's kind of the dance of the one and the many, so to speak. And
the inner unity of opposites.
What's that?
The inner unity of opposites.
Yes.
Yes.
There you go. That's exactly it. And so that was always, kind of on my mind, or I think for kids, it's always at the forefront of things. That I don't think that split between the world and me has occurred distinctly yet for kids.
Right.
And,
it's more of a natural state of understanding the world.
Yeah, it's much more fluid. It's not rigid. And I think they can kind of see separation and kind of see not separation until the world tells them through language, behavior, culture that no, separation is the norm. And then that's when kind of language goes from, we might say, from poetic to kind of rigid language.
Right.
And that's where identity goes from being a stream to being an ice cube. And that's when the objects of the world, as we call them, what are actually perceptions, these fluid perceptions, they start to coagulate into objects. And then that becomes kind of the platform for the rest of your life, for science, for how we talk and engage. So for me, I guess that was always in question. And I had never really committed one way or the other, but I kind of had that question mark as to what the world was.
Well, if that was the environment for you growing up, did your parents, was it less of a disillusionment for you growing up? It seems like for a lot of children that is stamped out of them more intensely than it was for you. But at the same time, you were a product of the Western education system, I assume.
Yeah.
So it's hard to avoid teachers doing that to you.
Right. And even at home, it's not that it was a complete it's not that we lived this, what we were learning. It's that we were learning this, so to speak. So, my parents still wanted me to do well in school, regardless of what school was teaching, whether it was kind of a workable or the best framework for living there is, or whether it's utter garbage, wherever it falls on the spectrum. They still wanted me to learn it and do well and get a job and all those things. So I still went through my disillusionments, I would say plural, many disillusionments,
Right.
and probably one very striking disillusionment. But I guess in a sense, I was always open to that. And in a way, probably I always knew that's where things would end up, just because nothing I learned in school seemed like very stable. It didn't seem like it had ground beneath it. You always had to kind of assume this platform and build your knowledge on top of that, right? Assume this platform of this dichotomous world and a bunch of separate objects, and then really try to figure out what's going on. And that never made much sense to me. So my disillusionments were probably, maybe, I guess, a little bit less dramatic, perhaps.
When you were, I was reading a article you wrote just a couple weeks ago. It was published, and the first line is, "Consciousness is not a popular topic for new exploration in my hospital." Is this? I think not popular is the right way to say it. It's like it makes me think of Carl Jung being like, I'm going to bring the mystics into this exploration of mental health, and Freud being like, no one's going to take us seriously if you start talking about that kind of stuff, and how that fear of being seen as like a charlatan was stopped. It stops people from being curious, to be open to other ideas, to even just being introspective about their own suspicions about consciousness or things they're interested in. And it, in other words, stops creativity. Is it hard for you to, you're obviously having a great time, but I don't even know what it's like. What's it like in the healthcare system? It's pretty claustrophobic in that way?
I think so, in terms of the attitudes toward this kind of topic. Now, in the last couple of years, there's a little bit more on consciousness, come in science. It's becoming popular. It's very sexy now to talk about consciousness in science.
Yeah.
Have models of consciousness, and I'm working on the neuroscience of consciousness and neurons and how they give rise to, this idea is very sexy now. But in clinical,
but it has to be through neuroscience. I feel like neuroscience is like the acceptable way to talk about it.
Yeah. And, in emergency medicine, we talk about consciousness, just not in the same way. Like we do sedation. So, for some procedures, we have to do sedation. So then we talk about levels of consciousness, or if somebody experiences trauma, we talk about loss of consciousness, or we might talk about like if somebody's obtunded or stuporous or lethargic, so that kind of consciousness. But we'll never talk about what consciousness is. That's just a different kind of conversation. I think that's a useful framework to begin with, this consciousness and what we're talking about, right? If we're talking about levels of consciousness, then what is this consciousness which has levels, right?
Right.
We can talk about levels of consciousness. Like we might talk about, like in a video game, you can talk about levels of the video game. I went to level 3, level 4, level 5.
Yep.
Okay, but what is the video game?
Right.
Like the nature, might say, of the software, for example, or the nature of the game itself, that will be different. And in medicine, including in what we call mental health or mental illness, in medicine, we have to remember that our model of the human being is radically incomplete. That's really where the problem starts. And I don't think we've identified that problem.
Our model of the human being. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. But yeah,
the model of the human being, because when we're talking about, at least in the medical model, when we're talking about diagnosis and treatment, that is based on some canvas that we have of the human being. Let's not forget that. We start from an idea that we have of who and what a human being is. Right. And based on that idea, we then move on to diagnosis and treatment. However,
Mm.
the model that we have, the picture we have, is of human anatomy. When we ask in medicine, we ask, what is a human being, or who's a human being, then boom, you get a picture. And that is the model of human anatomy. However, it's not a model of human anatomy. It's a model of human body anatomy.
Right.
And we totally kind of ignore that, right?
Right.
Our model of anatomy is not of the human being, it's of the human body. And once we forget that, once we forget the distinction that we are not looking at human anatomy per se, but human body anatomy, then we're lost. We're lost. It's like the situation is lost, because then you try to squeeze everything into this physical and anatomic picture without realizing that our picture is radically incomplete to begin with. And that's why I think that's why even the phrases mental health and mental illness are problematic, because our fundamental picture does not include mind that our diagnoses and treatments are based on.
Right. Because there is no picture of mind without brain.
Right.
Right.
Well, that's how it is now. Yes.
Right. So figuring out how we can talk about it's so actually, when you start thinking about it, how insane it is to only talk about one side of something, and act like that's the whole picture. And of course, that would be incredibly limiting.
Yeah.
But I guess you need how to represent thought and consciousness.
Well, I think the way to do that is to look at why we have divided these to begin with, right? Why have we created something called body? Why have we created something called mind, right? We have done this as adults.
Right.
We're the ones who created this language. We're the ones who have kind of made this split. It's not necessary that the split exists as it is in nature, but we have done this, right? We've invented this language. So the question is, again, why have we done this? And I think for where we are now, I think it's kind of an intellectual laziness. It's a kind of habit, right? We've heard mind-body medicine for so long. We know these cultures that are thousands of years old, whether it's China or India or other places in the world, have identified aspects of human anatomy that are not part of our model of human anatomy, but there is no curiosity to say, how do these two integrate, or how do these five integrate? Because after all, we're the same species, right? No matter which country you are. So we're still talking about Homo sapiens sapien. So if that's the case, why do we have five models of human anatomy that we cannot reconcile? That's such a fundamental sign of our ignorance that, frankly, we're just lazy about.
And why do we cling to the ignorance? Why do we cling to this embarrassment, ever deviating from the picture of the human body as being like science? That's it.
Well, I think it's important to remember that science has given us a lot. Like this, what this has done, it has made us specialists at the physicalized aspect of being human. We've become very good. We have an extraordinary understanding, of physical anatomy. And we've done so many great things, right? Like transplants and vaccines and pacemakers and antibiotics. We've been very successful in many ways. But I think we've conflated that success with the idea that all that we are is this kind of human body anatomy, that our models are correct. And I think our success is actually because we are incredibly creative beings, and we're incredibly talented beings doing science, and not because our model is right. We are doing well in spite of our model, not because of our model. And so I think what we need to do is go back and say, okay, we've really gone down this route, this physicalized thing, and we've really done a lot. And now we're like, this mind-body medicine is coming up. We're starting to see the intrusion of the subjective in the objective in physics, and chronic diseases are rising. We're seeing, our state of general health in the world overall. We're seeing chronic diseases rise, which is a problem even in something like the pandemic, where your baseline health makes a difference. So we've gone down this route. let's keep this knowledge, and now let's go back to the fork in the road where we took that path,
Right.
and go down the other route, or maybe go down these routes simultaneously and see what we find. And I think the reason we don't do that, again, is because we're confused about where our success comes from, and because, frankly, it's a lack of curiosity, and it's laziness, because that will require us to develop new skills, especially new skills of introspection.
Introspection,
It
absolutely.
will require us to say, hey, we're not really experts in this method. And I think there's a lot of hesitance in healthcare to say what we're not experts in, including
Right.
in certain aspects of healing. So I think that's why there's that reticence.
I mean, it's completely linked to poetry, because people are so, when you talk about poetry, inevitably what comes up with people who know nothing about poetry is like, they say, oh, poetry doesn't make any money. And they act like poetry is some sort of hobby on the side that's like beautiful, like fun, like beautiful language that you can use at a wedding, but doesn't really have any practical consequences in the real world. But I think it's absolutely a laziness in the fact that in order to appreciate poetry, you do have to do work to undo a lot of what you think about how you process information. You have to do a little work to engage with the text, right? So it's not easy. It's not like reading a fiction book that's like very engaging, for instance. So of course there's an element of laziness, and also I think a lot of fear at the introspection that inevitably comes with poetry, because poetry deals so solely, almost, I would say, with consciousness and unconscious. Consciousness includes unconsciousness. When you say
yes,
yeah, okay, consciousness and the individual as their in their introspection. But also, the misunderstanding is that poetry is written, and I think the misunderstanding actually ironically comes from a lot of the writers themselves, is that their poems are limited to their I'll like to use your metaphor, their ice cube, and that it only stays there. When in fact, the most successful poetry and the most beautiful, engaging, fierce poetry is the kind that is more like vapor, more like water. It brings the person reading it along with them, and it's really an instance of like sharing consciousness. Of course, there's all different ways to talk about what that means. Is there even a separation between our consciousnesses?
Yeah,
I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that. But I mean, needless to say that my experience and your experience could overlap in my poem, so I don't know. I mean, I know in my heart that it makes you a better person to read poetry. It makes you a more creative and useful person in the world. But it's hard to explain that with our system that we have in place right now, obviously. It's frustrating.
Yeah. I see it as there's this ongoing grappling. There's this ongoing, creative tension, this kind of pulling. Like I feel you pulling a string like this, and I feel me pulling it back this way right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the world is fundamentally. And my feeling is that the society often tries to create a safe environment where there's no pulling back and forth. And I think when you do that, you're not really in the world. But I think that's what a lot of this stuff is about. Like, the kind of the comforting, the world of comfort. Not that we can't be comfortable, but there's something to life that's not comfortable. It's constantly creating, it's constantly uncertain, and that creating tension is there. And I think poetry makes you feel that. Like
Mhm.
you have to feel that to be engaged in poetry. I feel.
Yes.
I'm not speaking as a poet,
Sure,
but
but
from what I see,
it's just as important as a reader to speak to what happens in poetry.
yeah, it's like you're in this relationship where something can happen, you know.
Right.
And I think the society is not, at least like a lot of the public messaging is that that's bad, that you
Right.
kind of want to get out of that uncertainty, and we want the certainty.
Oh my God, it's totally about uncertainty and our discomfort with uncertainty. And it's not, I'm not saying, it's funny because like talking about this, I feel like I'm acting like I'm morally superior, which I'm totally not. I struggle with it all the time. Like I feel really uncomfortable. I better have a drink right now. Or, something like just trying to get out of like the elements of uncertainty is hard to submit to. At the same time, I find certainty and redundancy and predictability to be on worse, like just as unbearable. And there's a lot of excitement with uncertainty. You talk a lot about, well, I talk a lot about nothing. At the top of your framework is this idea of the three minds. Can you tell me what this is?
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. So the whole idea of the three minds is that the kind of model of the world that we're taught in school is radically incomplete. And rather, I would say that the world is essentially an appearance and interpretation in consciousness, rather than there being some external world out there or external object or thing out there. That the whole thing is like kind of like a shimmering appearance in consciousness. And it's no different fundamentally in terms of the mechanics than what might happen in a dream, where there is a dreaming mind. And then, of course, it takes on multiple identities as characters, as objects, as the flow of space and time, as dimensions, as space, and so on. And similar to that, it's on a different scale, is what we are experiencing here. The implications of that is that, of course, Bianca and Anoop are two characters, and this is simply an aspect of what we are, right? As these bodies, as these personalities kind of talking to each other and learning about each other, this is one aspect of what we are. And there are subtler aspects that are, let's say, less embodied than this.
Yeah.
And so the three minds is essentially a model that models this, that frameworks this in some way, saying that at the individual level, which is the first mind that we are given by society, so to speak, by the adults in our lives, what we learn to do is narrow our awareness into this kind of ice cube, into this discrete thing that we call a body. And as we narrow this, the world also becomes narrow because it's a reflection of each other. So this localization of identity happens. And all of a sudden, whereas I didn't call myself anything before, I start calling myself Anoop. And I start calling you Bianca, and I call that a wall, and I call this a floor. Basically, it's a world of discreteness and localization and separation that kind of encrusts this awareness. That's the first mind level of experience. And this is where science starts, right? I am here, the object is there. Let me study the object, minimize my influence on it, which I call bias, right? Just minimize this relationship and start to study that out there. And of course, we did well with that. And what we're understanding now is that the more I want to know what that is, the more I have to start to know what this is. That's where we are now in science. This is now we're on the border of the first and second mind, where we're starting to see that, whoa, those things that I see out there are somehow seem to be really linked to what this is right here. And through introspection, this localized nugget of identity that feels like it's in a particular place in the head or in the body or near the body, then can delocalize, meaning that the boundary becomes less rigid. The boundary of habit, the boundary of conditioning, the boundary of idea, the boundary of culture, the boundary of experience becomes deconditioned and delocalizes, such that the experience of identity is no longer localized to a particular kind of physicalized dimension, which is what the first mind world is. The world that we take as a GPS coordinate, as a range of geography, is actually a physicalized experience of mind in this model. So as the second mind, the sense of identity shifts to this more non-local nature, which then differentiates as the particularities of the first mind discrete world.
And the third?
And the third mind is simply that potential which can appear either as delocalized, as what we call non-local, or as localized. So the second mind is kind of this dance. It's kind of like this flow.
But isn't the second mind the conceptual mind? That's thought?
No, the second mind is non-conceptual. The thought to me is still the first mind, in the sense that we can still identify a particular thought, right? We can, let's say we do some kind of meditative practice, and we can start to see, oh, there's a thought that's coming up, for example.
Okay.
Or I can notice, oh, my mind is really active, or oh, my mind is calm, or it's sad. So we can still identify those, and therefore anything that's distinctly identifiable in that sense has a boundary. Whether we call it physical, whether we call it mental, it has a boundary, and we are able to distinguish it from its background. Okay. And therefore it's of the first mind quality.
So the second mind has a quality of nothingness, or it's not, you can't, if it's not, it's an identity.
It is identity. Rather than an identity, it is identity, which localizes as the individual sense of identity, or more generally, which localizes as discreteness itself. Anywhere, anything that is discrete, anywhere there's this kind of boundary that we can differentiate, foreground, background, this, that, here, there, me, you. This is the crystallizing of identity as something particular and local.
That's fascinating. And of course, you would have to have that. Of course, that would have to be there, Of course, it would be there. But in order to, well, is it like who's thinking the thought, or what is thinking the thought?
Yeah, these are kind of the intimations, the kind of avenues that the passageways may be between the first and the second mind. It's these kinds of exercises that maybe we call it metacognition or meta-awareness, where we kind of go to the meta subject level and say, oh, yeah, what is this that's thinking the thought? And when that identity shifts from the first mind that is asking what it is that is thinking the thought to being what that is not just thinking the thought, but that is also thinking these thoughts. Thinking Bianca, thinking Anoop, thinking the podcast, and the pictures up on the wall, and the very idea of space and time, the very idea that you are somewhere else and I am somewhere else, that kind of the hardened physicalization, that too is the thought of, we can say, of this second mind.
That's really incredible and important to talk about and to think about in terms of, I talk so much about writing poetry, and I'm always trying to figure out ways to help not just myself, but other people like improve their writing. And like a lot of the editing process with people is like trying to get them to think about how they even approach writing a poem, what state of mind they're in, and how limiting they are to themselves, because they're so locked into, I would say, like this first state of mind. There is, I feel like, an important, there's a really important state of mind. State of mind seems like the state of being that is more aligned with the second mind, in order to truly get at something more than just mere language in a poem, right? So like, I feel like there's this thing in art where you're trying to get at something more than just mere communication. Like there's some ineffable part of it that is really crucial, but how can you talk about the untalkable thing, untalkable thing, the unmentionable, the unutterable, the negative space that is really important to create and to be. It is linked to a kind of, I feel like, enjoyment in life. Like, what's the point of any of this, right? It's like, I think to feel more vivid and like fulfilled and creative, just like sitting here, like doing nothing.
Yeah.
Whereas, and I feel like the healthcare system is a really good metaphor for all this, because there's something deeply disturbing about the healthcare system in that it's health and it's care, and yet it feels so damaging as like an individual, like entering into it. I feel like my experience with going to the hospital is like humiliation and like disappointment, and like doctors just like trying to get me out of there as fast as possible with like some arbitrary answer to my question. And I don't, that's just like, that's so dark. I mean, the possibility of a healthcare system being actually like full and nurturing and like, I do you feel like we're going in a, I mean, we're here talking about it. Surely I think that there's some sort of turn that's happening, some sort of movement is happening. And I'm grateful for the pandemic, frankly, that we've been able to have forced introspection on individual level and in society. But do you think there's a change in the actual structures of the system and to include more of this kind of awareness?
I think there is. The change is certainly happening. It's come through the avenue. Initially, remember, it was called alternative medicine. That was the first kind of entree.
Yeah, I never hear that anymore.
Right. Well, that became complementary medicine because alternative suggests that you should not do one kind of medicine. So that was done away with, and it became complementary because it's one next to the other. Then it said, well, they're not really two. Medicine is medicine. So then it became integrative medicine. That's where we are now, integrative medicine. But there's still a step to go. We need to go beyond integrative medicine to just medicine, or maybe just healing. And I think for that to happen, we have to do what is so far been unthinkable in healthcare, which is to question this relationship between matter and mind, or in a more practical sense, question our model, our anatomical model of the human being. And, you know, Bianca, you said, you talked about the darkness. It's important to know that, you know, we physicians, we nurses are also suffering. You know, it's an all around, I mean, either we understand the human being or we don't, right? It's not that some people are understood and some people aren't. Like, the models are incomplete all around. And that's why in healthcare, we're seeing like I think the physician suicide rate is twice that of the general population.
Jesus,
so
really?
Think about that. Yeah, think about that. That's not widely known, you know? So physicians and nurses are suffering for the exact same reason that patients feel not seen, which is that physicians and nurses are not seen, because we have this robotized view of the human being, that we are machines, essentially, right?
Why does it stay that way? It's like, who is this that's keeping it this way? Because if I mean, I know it's just like, because it's the way it's been, but who's winning out here? If it's like the physicians and the patients are both unhappy, it seems so frustrating and nonsensical to keep it going this way, because we're lazy and don't want to. Everyone's like, well, no, we couldn't do it on any other way. This is the only way.
Well, this comes back to your earlier question as to whether it's hard. You asked me if it's hard to do what I do. And in a sense, it is hard, because the more you speak up, the more you are putting your own kind of profession kind of up in the air, you know, because you're saying, hey, we, at some level, we don't know what we're doing. And I think that's true. I think it's very hard for people to hold both of these together, that we can be experts in an aspect of what we do, and we can also know very little about some aspects of the human being that are critical to health and healing.
Yeah.
Like, these are both true. And I think it's hard to hold those two together. So if that needs to come out, then people need to speak up and talk more. And that means, I've had physicians say all the time, what are you talking about? Like, I don't understand this. This doesn't make sense, or this is alternative medicine. It's none of those things. It's simply, frankly, looking at our models that we use to look at human beings, to look at ourselves, and be willing to say that, hey, we're not doing this as well as we could. And at some point, I think it becomes negligent to not have a more complete model of the human being.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not something that I think a lot of people are willing to say, because it's calling your own expertise into question. But I think we need to do that. I think we need to be comfortable saying, hey, I know what I know, but I'm also going to say this whole part which I don't know about the human being. And yeah, maybe we've got this wrong, or at least radically incomplete. What can we do about this? We need to start saying that. But that requires being able to kind of say, hey, I'm not an expert in this. Hey, I may be willing to give up this salary. All of that is part of it. And when it kind of comes home to roost, so to speak, then sometimes we don't have enough people speaking up. And that's part of the reason I'm speaking up, is because I think the public needs to hear this and start thinking about it themselves.
Yeah.
Because there is no single expert on the human being, whether you're a physician or a psychologist, or we're all human beings, and we all have access to the tools we need to see ourselves more completely.
We do. And I wonder about it seems that the conversation around psychotherapy is, maybe it's just because I'm like really into it right now, but it just seems really interesting and growing right now. More awareness of the evolution of it, we get stuck in these really archaic ways of thinking, and we think, oh, it's always going to be this way, because we finally reached some sort of idea of what, it's just like poetry. We've reached some idea of what poetry is, and now we can just keep doing that. But we forget that at one time it was thought of completely differently, and somebody was like, what about writing about the way I'm feeling instead of, about the queen's dress or whatever. Yeah. And we forget that right now is just a small blip in the grand scheme of things. And we absolutely don't know everything. I mean, we probably not even close, right? Yeah. Sorry, I'm like jumping all over the place, but I was totally blown away by, I gave a reading like a month ago online with this planetarium, and they started off with this 10-minute planetarium show, and it was like the most amazing thing I've ever, I don't know why. It's like I know about the universe, I've watched the cosmos, I love all that stuff, but like for some reason this really struck me, because it was like a complete parallel to things I was writing about in my poems that had nothing to do with the universe. And I realized it kept there's something cool about the way they'll do some planetarium shows where they'll start really micro and they'll go out and out and out and out until they're in like multiverse. And then of course they start talking about dark matter. And what I love about talking about dark matter is that they just say dark matter because they don't know what to call it, but it's just this massive thing that's everywhere and everything, and we don't know anything about it. And it just opens up all, you start realizing how tiny and limited, that's even the wrong way of putting it. I hate saying it makes me feel tiny, because it doesn't make me feel tiny. It actually makes me feel infinite and huge.
Yeah.
And I loved the feeling. And it made me feel completely at ease and comfortable, and at the same time terrified, because it is terrifying. And there is a lot of darkness there, literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
I forget why I'm even saying any of this, but I just hope, I find myself really hoping that we pull it together and mine the possibilities of being the human race on this planet, because we could be so incredible. It would be, reading your articles, I was thinking, my God, what if all doctors were like this? What, like how amazing it would be. What a different experience we would have. Like if scientists were like this as they were investigating nature, we would have such a more complex, I feel like our inventions would be more complex, our evolution would be more complex, we'd go further.
Yeah, I think they'd be more complex and simpler simultaneously. It would be like, it's like when you think of breathing, like breathing is one of the most amazing experiences. If you actually stop to think about, the process of the chest volume increasing, and therefore the pressure dropping, and therefore the pressure gradient causes air to surge in, and then how the whole oxygen is transported. It's an incredibly complex process, but it's almost like sculpture. Like it's poetry. There's such a beauty and effortlessness. I mean, we don't even think about it most of the time, of the cadence of breathing, and yet it's so essential to biological life, and I think that combination of complexity and simplicity would be what healing is about, would be like that's a technology. Breathing is a technology, eating is a technology whereby whatever we put in our mouth becomes Bianca or becomes Anoop, is incredible technology, but we don't think of it that way. And I think that paradoxical complex simplicity would be a lot of what our so-called inventions would be like. It would be very, I think, simpler solutions to a lot of these things, because I think so long as we have a limited, or the extent to which we have an understanding ourselves is the extent to which we can externalize that as our inventions, right? The human body heals itself magnificently. Like when we take an antibiotic, it's not that the antibiotic heals the human being, it kind of aids the body's already ongoing process by which it kind of restores itself. So the restorative capacity of the human being is already there. And I think the extent to which we have insight into that is the extent to which we can kind of create that outside of ourselves, so to speak. And to me, that would be a simpler kind of living, and yet a more magnificent one. This universe that you're speaking about, this is the reason it feels so intimate to me. Yes, because as far as we can go, like from the first mind horizon, the universe and the stars and galaxy is as far as we can go, right? We don't know, does it even mean anything to say there is something beyond that, from the first mind horizon?
Right.
And so
first mind horizon, God, I love that. Sorry.
So what we're doing is like we've stretched ourselves as much as that first mind goes before it pops, right? In looking at dark matter and looking at the distant galaxies. And to me, when that balloon pops, what's left is the second mind, whose nature is this kind of space, where that kind of outer space and that inner space there's no real difference between that. These are kind of mirrors, in meditation, it's very similar experiences as looking at outer space through the first mind. And I think that is because these boundaries start to break down, and we begin to appreciate kind of this all-in-one, one in all, and then able to kind of filter out the separateness and the discreteness as we wish. It's kind of like an engaging thing to do. That's the creative tension where we're
Right.
kind of pulling.
In and out. And the third one you said is the possibility of both. So the third, is that what you said?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to describe that beyond saying something like potential.
Right. I
It's
like that.
it's potential, and in its kind of illumined non-locality, it appears as what I call the second mind, which is where the dance begins between the discrete and the non-local.
You know, James Barnes we talk about this a lot, but this idea of objects out in the world, we've talked about this a bit already, but objects out in the world, the objects that we can see, touch, as not actually being separate from us, or something that it's not that we are placed here in this set, is that you were saying earlier, is that it's almost a is projection the right word? I mean, it doesn't really, it almost seems not fair to say that, because it's like, it has consequences.
Yeah.
That you feel like, oh, it's all my fault that like this truck hit my mom because or something like that.
I wouldn't use projection in that sense. I said the word projection, but I didn't mean, I know it can be used in a lot of senses. I think it's more like a reflection of what we are. Like that this deeper identity kind of thinks itself as what we experience as the multiplicitous world. And it's not that I as an individual am projecting this experience. That's not what I mean. I mean, it's more like if you look at a projector, like in the movies where they have the reels and there's the light, and then the world is kind of projected. In that sense, it's like the light show aspect of it is what I'm referring to with the word projection.
It's amazing because it does it simply opens up more possibilities for learning, and thinking and creating. And I think that's what I love the most about everything you're doing, is that it's just encouraging us to be more thoughtful about what it means to be alive and what it means to be in a body. That I see so much suffering around me and the people I love, and the people on Twitter, and we think a lot about suffering and we're always trying to avoid it and get out of it, and yet we seem to be clinging to it, and it's like it's like we need a new framework in order to understand, or to even just get curious about what suffering is. And I was talking about this with somebody on Twitter. He was feeling anxiety about feeling that he had to write poems about trauma, and how he didn't want to do that necessarily, but felt this expectation in the current climate in poetry to explore personal trauma. And I was thinking to myself that we're thinking about it wrong, because it's not about confessing your personal trauma and making some drama out of it. It's more about the fact that there's a sort of inherent suffering that comes, and you were talking about this before, this tension of the discomfort of being alive and interacting with the world, and that unknowability of why things happen and what's happening to us. And poetry, I feel like, is a perfect space to explore it, because because we don't have a language to talk about it with. So it does seem that poetry, or not just poetry, but art, and these things are sort of important to talk about aspects of consciousness in thinking about creating a complete picture of the body, and in thinking about how to allow for understanding of the complete picture for someone like a med student, let's say.
Yeah.
You mentioned in one of your articles that in med school, like maybe you would bring this kind of stuff into the education, and in that way to bolster their capabilities as doctors. I mean, do you think this is, is med school must be like completely limited to studying the body itself? I mean, is there, I guess in neuroscience, you would be maybe getting into the consciousness discussion.
Yeah, I think it's changing, certainly, especially in the last 10 years, as we talk more about, well-being or managing well, or not being too stressed out, being able to handle what's going on, all these kinds of words and phrases that we use. What it's all suggesting is basically looking at the whole human being. That's really what we're talking about. We just haven't made that connection yet, and we haven't drawn it all the way to our model of the human being yet. But certainly there is room for that conversation. I think the beginnings of that are already happening. I am going to be giving a talk at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. It's going to be part of a leadership course there. So,
Nice.
There is some openness to this. It is happening.
Yeah.
And it's also, there's that practical sense of evolving our model of anatomy, just as we went from let's say Sushruta to Vesalius to Henry Gray, and this model of anatomy is always evolving. Anatomy is not a fixed thing that's out there that we are going to discover. It's our vision of the human being is what we call anatomy. And as we evolve, as our vision evolves, our understanding and experience of anatomy will evolve. And this, in terms of the second mind view, it's, other than simply exploring, it's very practical in the sense that I hope that it will help to delocalize our understanding of health and disease, right? That it's not located in one place, whether it's in the brain or even in the body or even out there in society. It is a delocalizing and non-local phenomenon that we call health and disease, that the environment and the body and you and me, that all of us have a role in this. And while we understand this theoretically, it's not a part of our practice. And the reason it's not, again, is because our model of anatomy is so radically incomplete and localized. So I think there are very practical aspects to this beyond simply exploring, which is where it has to start.
Well, let's be real here too. I feel like going to the doctor is about getting a prescription filled every time I go to doesn't matter what kind of doctor it is. That's really what it is. And that's like all the conversation that we have. And I mean, maybe blood work, but usually not, because it's too expensive and it doesn't seem to tell you much anyway. I don't know what healthcare is like for like rich people. I don't know what they get. Maybe they get more extensive care than that, but I think I don't want to like get into a whole discussion about big farm, whatever, but I think it ultimately has to be addressed because it's getting in the way of any progress being made, that, and not only the pharmaceutical companies, but the insurance companies, obviously, which is just criminal. I just on a personal level, it's not even like I'm hearing about it being criminal. It's just like is criminal, like in my household. When I get letters from them, they're like, oh, you've been doing this, we decided to stop doing that because you've been, the fact that you've been actually, utilizing your physical therapist, we're going to stop, they're just assholes. It's just awful.
Yeah.
But moreover, I was thinking a lot about medication, antidepressants, as I'm weaning off of them. Finally, after, having a therapist who's like, we don't talk about it that much, but he's like there for, I know I'm in like a safer place to go off them. We've like come to a place where I can do it. I'm like talking to my general practitioner about it, blah, blah, blah. But what I find so disturbing about the whole experience is that I did really need them for the crisis, absolutely, and I'm grateful that they're in existence. But nobody talked to me about the fact that they actually were like covering emotions that were necessary to feel in order to actually heal.
Yeah.
And that conversation was never had, even though the doctor was concerned for my mental health, but only to get me to take enough medication and to stay on it forever.
Yeah.
But it seemed that it was just as much element of needing to feel certain feelings in order to heal than it was to address the I'm like, the things that happen in your head when they're connecting or not connecting, whatever it is, they're like, oh, like depression is like completely like a problem with your brain that we need to fix. That has nothing to do with emotions, even though at the same time they're like, let's talk about your feelings in therapy. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just don't you feel like it's like there's all these roadblocks in the way of doctors that seem it's so oppressive. It's like you do nothing but have to deal with health insurance. It seems like 90% of the experience.
Yeah, well, you touched on so many things there. I don't know if I'll remember all
I'm sorry, I'm like totally rambling, all up in arms about it.
No, it's good. Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that the kind of the knee-jerk response where somebody presents with something happening and the response is a prescription. I can tell you that some of the hardest moments I have in the ER is when a person comes in for something and I talk to them, do an evaluation, and at the end I say, well, I can tell you it's not A, B, C, or D, and there's no emergency. It's safe for you to go home and follow up. But very often a person wants a diagnosis. Well, what is this? Right. And for many reasons, one, it could be that, in the ER, there's no time, there's not enough of a follow-up, a process in place to make the definitive diagnosis. Many times there is, but many times it's good that we don't make the definitive diagnosis, because the more pronounced it is, the more likely it is that it could be something that's an emergency or something that's gone wrong. So many times I say, look, I can tell you it's not all this, and it's these are the things to do to follow up, but I can't. Many times the final diagnosis will be what they said. For example, abdominal pain or chest pain will be the final diagnosis. And I think that's entirely appropriate, because it's basically saying we know it's not these things, but we can't say what it is. And let's see, you're still kind of living in that uncertainty, but that can be very hard. And that's where this idea that, okay, giving some particular diagnosis or even giving a particular prescription that's going to somehow take care of this, even if we don't exactly know where it is, that's where that difficulty arises. Yes, like I said, going back to what you said before, whether it's hard speaking about this stuff, because at some point you come to the fact that your education is radically incomplete. Right. You have to go there. And I think especially for physicians, that's hard, because we are considered the experts in a sense on the human body and on what's going on and on diagnosis. And there's a certain societal prestige in being a physician, and there's a certain income associated with that in society. And so you're kind of making this decision as to whether you're being frank about what we know and what we don't know. And I think the public would appreciate just that kind of frankness, saying, hey, we know what we know, we don't know what we know, and we need to go there. But if we don't go there, and if we can't talk about that, then we get into exactly what you're talking about, where it's like you end up getting into this rut where you have to give a prescription for everything somebody says, because we're so dependent on just this model of physicalizing everything. So it's like if somebody says they're having a certain experience, then we associate that with, let's say, neurotransmitters in the brain, and then we ascribe causation, and it's a very slippery slope, all because we haven't kind of looked at our initial model, I think, to begin with. I can tell you that in my own personal practice, looking at my own emotions is probably been the most important aspect of my own development. You know, that when I close my eyes and when I relax and there's nothing else going on, and the first thing that will come up is if there were any emotions that I haven't felt, that I haven't allowed to come through. And I find that to be incredibly important, like the most important aspect, which allowing that to come through then makes room for all the other insights and creativity and, you know, this everything that I do, the writing, the 3 minds framework, second mind, all this kind of stuff comes after that. That clarity only comes after that. And if that doesn't happen, and on top of that, we have this incomplete model, that's when we start, you know, we have all of these labels for accumulations of emotions and distress, which is what a lot of the mental illness diagnoses are about.
That's something that, without anything changing in the bigger picture, that doctors and people could just start doing right now. I love that.
Yeah.
Just stopping. Thank you so much for talking with me. I hope this isn't the last time we talk. There's just so much that you're doing. There's so many different avenues that you're going down. Obviously, there's some like the fundamentals here, but I just appreciate so much that you're out there, that you're saying these things, that you're talking with so many people, that you're having so many conversations, that you're so personable. This is not you up on stage just like talking down to everyone. You're really having conversations with individuals and other people, and I'm so grateful.
Oh, thank you so much, Bianca. It's been wonderful speaking with you, and always wonderful speaking to somebody who is in that uncertainty with me.
Absolutely. We're never leaving it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Roostone House podcast, and thanks so much to Anoop Kumar. See all our podcasts at podcast.roostonehouse.org. Check out Anoop's work at anoopkumar.com. The podcast music was made by Walter Stone. If you go to the podcast page, you will see a transcription of Anoop and I's email exchange that elucidates a few more points that we started on this conversation. Please feel free to write to us at info@roostonehouse.org with your questions and comments, or comment on our social media. Thank you. Bye.